Hello, I'm Nick, and this is Today in Philosophy of History for Monday, 15 January 2024. It is the 110th anniversary of the birth of Hugh Redwald Trevor-Roper, who was born in Glanton, Northumberland on this date in 1914. Well over 30 years ago, almost 35 years ago, I was in Brussels in 1990. And whenever I travel, I go to bookstores. So when I was in Brussels, just a couple days before coming back, I bought this copy of The European Witch Craze of the 16th and 17th Century by Hugh Trevor-Roper. I read it on the flight back, and it made an impression on me that I never forgot. So you could say that it personally influenced my outlook in a way that other historians have not, just because it came to me at a time when I was prepared to learn from it, you could say. So both Ted Carr in his What is History and Geoffrey Elton in his The Practice of History mention Hugh Trevor-Roper. So you could say that he's caught in the crossfire of the Carr-Elton debate. Carr criticized him for being insufficiently progressive, and Elton criticized him for implying the pettiness of having too narrow of a research field. Trevor-Roper was among those who denied that history is a science, and he was pretty explicit about being an art. And he said in his talk, Past and Present from 1968, quote, "History itself, though resting on an ever more scientific base, remains itself too human a subject, too dependent on accident, too variable in the proportion even of its recurrent features to be safely predictable. We may predict in detail and conditionally where we have the means of comparison, and such limited predictions may be scientifically or at least empirically tested and so justified and useful. But generally and absolutely, there can be no prediction, only a guess. And a guess is, in the strict sense, worthless," unquote. This denial of historical prediction, of course, makes us think of Karl Popper, who characterized any view of history that emphasized or affirmed the possibility of prediction to be historicism, and this to be any kind of theoretical history of this kind to be impossible. So Trevor-Roper seems to be echoing that. And usually you find this view of prediction together with the idea that there are laws of history. And of laws of history, Trevor-Roper said, quote, "There are numerous conditional laws of history, empirical rules which can be taken from a wide range of historical experience. Any of them may be applicable to the present. None of them provides a certain formula for the present. For one safe rule of history is that historical situations never exactly repeat themselves. There are too many variable ingredients in each situation for identical recurrence. Even if they should do so, the mere fact of repetition is a new ingredient which may alter the mixture," unquote. This reminds us of Carl Hempel, of whom I spoke in a video just a few days ago, who emphasized the covering law model of history, but the subsequent criticism of Hempel's covering law model was that history makes use of generalizations which fall short of something that we would identify as a scientific law. And that seems to be what Trevor-Roper is saying in this passage. So not only is Trevor-Roper caught between Carr and Elton in their debate, but he's also, in a sense, caught between Popper and Hempel in their debate over the role of predictability and the role of laws in history. Although he didn't write any treatise on historiography or his conception of history, he did drop some interesting hints. And one of the ones that I find most interesting is in the first few pages of The Rise of Christian Europe, published in 1965, where he introduces what I would call the criterion of purposive movement as the definition of history. Quote, I do not deny that men existed even in dark countries and dark centuries, nor that they had political life and culture, interesting to sociologists and anthropologists. But history, I believe, is essentially a form of movement, and purposive movement too. It is not a mere phantasmagoria of changing shapes and costumes, of battles and conquests, dynasties and usurpations, social forms and social disintegration. If all history is equal, as some now believe, there is no reason why we should study one section of it rather than another. For certainly we cannot study it all. Then indeed we may neglect our own history and amuse ourselves with the unrewarding gyrations of barbarous tribes in picturesque but irrelevant corners of the globe. Tribes whose chief function in history, in my opinion, is to show to the present an image of the past from which by history it has escaped. Or shall we seek to avoid the indignation of the medievalists by saying from which it has changed, unquote. And a little further along in the same, I think, first chapter, something of a restatement, quote, the positive content of history consisted not in the meaningless fermentation of passive or barbarous societies, but in the movement of society, the process, conscious or unconscious, by which certain societies at certain times had risen out of the barbarism once common to all, unquote. I think that latter quote occurs in an exposition of Hume and Hume's conception of history that Hume put in his History of England. So the criterion of purposive movement has parallels in others. And I found this passage in Ted Carr's What is History, which I mentioned earlier and in my video on how to get started in philosophy of history, that seems to me somewhat close, though not exactly the same. Quote, the line of demarcation between prehistoric and historic times is crossed when people ceased to live only in the present and became consciously interested both in their past and in their future. History begins with the handing down of tradition, and tradition means the carrying of the habits and lessons of the past into the future. Records of the past begin to be kept for the benefit of future generations, unquote. We could say that the transmission of tradition lends directionality to history. So is directionality on its own a form of purposive movement? I think we could say it's one form of purposive movement. It may be that there is more than one kind of purposive movement, and what Carr is telling us about the transmission of tradition is one kind of purposive movement, but we can leave the question open as to whether there are other kinds of purposive movement in history and whether Hugh Trevor-Roper meant some other kind of purposive movement. Near the end of the same book, The Rise of Christian Europe, Trevor-Roper writes, quote, the line of progress may not be straight or even continuous, for history presents many obstacles, social petrification here, political decay there, demographic failure, disease, mere accident, and the register of human crime and folly. Through these obstacles, history is the story of social forces, of the rejuvenation or sclerosis of institutions, of the fertile or infertile contact of ideas. We can see our own place in the process today. Today, after a long period of predominance, we have gone through a structural crisis which may be compared with that of the 14th century. We have had our loss of colonies, our Mongol Empire, our social troubles, our 100 Years' War, but I do not think that we should therefore suppose that European history is closed. The history of the past may help us to explain what one of the most distinguished living historians, I refer to the great Dutch historian Peter Giel, has called the vitality of Western civilization, unquote. In this passage, Trevor-Roper doesn't invoke purposive movement, but he does invoke progress. And so we could think of progress as one kind of purposive movement, just as I suggested a moment ago, that directionality may be another form of purposive movement, and there may be others as well. Implicit in what Trevor-Roper's criterion of purposive movement implies for history is that prehistory is not any history at all. It lacks purposive movement in a sense. And he uses the term barbarism in his exposition, which is a term that historians mostly avoid these days, but be that as it may, Trevor-Roper does, criticize barbarism as being without purposive movement. But this invoked the response of Finn Fugelstad in a 1992 paper titled "The Trevor-Roper Trap, or the Imperialism of History, an Essay." And here he says, quote, "The contention that only purposive movement history is real history needs to be rejected. I feel strongly that the only acceptable definition of history is that it is the study of the past, any past, including, for want of a better term, ebb and flow history. Everything, or at least nearly everything, that has happened in the past ought to be of equal importance to the historian, since it all partakes of the experience of mankind. It is this experience in all its diversity which we need to unravel and to comprehend as far as possible, if, that is, we want to understand how we came to where we are and what and where we are not," unquote. This introduces the concept of ebb and flow history, which is clearly and intentionally distinct from purposive movement. If we think of purposive movement as unidirectional or having a directionality, ebb and flow implies cyclicality, or at least more than one direction. So it's not unidirectional. It's not necessarily linear. So Fugelstad doesn't outright deny the reality of purposive movement, but he says that purposive movement is another, ebb and flow history is another kind of history. And it seems to apply to prehistory to a certain extent. But there are ways we can apply it beyond that. In fact, Edward Gibbon, in his great Decline and Fall, History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, suggests a kind of ebb and flow conception of history as applied to civilization specifically. This is from chapter 46, Troubles in Persia, part 1. Quote, "The events by which the fate of nations is not materially changed leave a faint impression on the page of history, and the patience of the reader would be exhausted by the repetition of the same hostilities, undertaken without cause, prosecuted without glory, and terminated without effect," unquote. That sentence, by the way, is a great example of Gibbon's periodic style. So in this passage, Gibbon implies that what he's describing are almost below the level of interest of history. And if we take each of his provisions of this sentence, we could say that events that are of historical interest are those events by which the fate of nations are materially changed, when hostilities are not mere repetitions, when they are not undertaken with good cause, without good cause, I should say, and prosecuted with glory and are terminated with great effect. One could call this the material change criterion of history and contrast it to the purposive movement criterion of history of Trevor-Roper. Certainly the two would overlap at some point. There were some purposive movements that would constitute material change, and there might be some purposive movement that don't constitute material change. It's an interesting question. It would all depend on how narrowly or widely we defined material change or purposive movement. But despite Gibbon's implicit criterion of material change, he did go ahead and write the history of Byzantium in the later parts of his Decline and Fall. The impression I get from the history of Gibbon's history is that he intended only, when he started out the whole project, he intended only to write, well, his first idea, the famous passage in his autobiography, he talks about listening to the friars in doing their vespers as he sat in the Roman Forum. He thinks only of the decline and fall of the city, and then it expands to the decline and fall of the Western Empire. But since he's done all that, then he continued on and did the decline and fall of the Eastern Empire as well. And by doing so, he demonstrated that it was implicitly worth his historical inquiry. But one might argue also that since Gibbon was writing the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, the Byzantine chapter of the Roman Empire was particularly relevant. So we might ask, is the decline of a civilization a purposive movement? It seems superficially to be the fall away from a purposive movement. So do we record the decline of a society only because it once held historical value, or is the process itself a historical process? Are the rearguard movements to shore up a failing civilization a purposive movement? That would seem to be so. But in the last collapse, is that purposive? Or do we just tell the rest of the story because for the satisfaction of closure? So to return to the Carr-Elton debate, Ted Carr makes a distinction between mere facts and historical facts, which seems to mirror or echo what Gibbon makes in his distinction between what's material and immaterial to history. There seems to be an area for Gibbon that's in which nothing materially changes, and other area of history in which things do materially change. And we could reconcile that with Carr's distinction between mere facts and historical facts. So mere facts are those that do not involve a material change, and historical facts are those which do involve a historical change. So Carr wrote about what he called, quote, the process by which a mere fact about the past is transformed into a fact of history, unquote. But Carr's criteria for historically relevant facts are quite different from those of Gibbon. Gibbon is concerned, as we saw, with material change. Carr is concerned with the existing historical record and previous historians having already invoked a fact to make it worthy of inclusion in historical record. Jeffrey Elton was sharply critical of Carr on this distinction and wrote that it was, quote, an extraordinarily arrogant attitude both to the past and to the place of the historian in studying it, unquote. For Elton, it's sufficient that the fact be knowable and then it's a part of history. And we could speculate for Trevor-Roper, a fact would be a historical fact if it were a fact that contributed to or was involved in purposive movement. Now, earlier I mentioned that Trevor-Roper's criterion implies that prehistory is not history because it seems to exclude what has come to be called prehistory. But in the past 100 years, prehistory has grown significantly to the point where it's very difficult now to make the distinction between history and prehistory because of the growth of what are called the auxiliary sciences of history, like sigillography, the study of seals, or epigraphy, the study of inscriptions, but especially archaeology. Archaeology has unearthed so much information about the past and allowed us to reconstruct histories that have since been lost to written history, but which a sufficiently careful excavation and the study of material artifacts of the past allow us to recreate, even if they weren't written by the people who made the history. We could argue that the formation of a civilization exhibits purposive movement. And so this prehistory is correctly history, even if there aren't written texts of it. And this is like a mirror image in the past of the future of that civilization that takes form. Eventually it breaks down. So I asked a few minutes ago, is the breakdown or the collapse of a civilization, is that a purposive movement? Is the formation of a civilization a purposive movement? So the whole stretch from the prehistory of a civilization in its distant past, unrecorded, that's a purposive movement toward the civilization. And then after, as the civilization falls apart and it lets off into other waters of civilization, as it were, then that is also, is that all part of the purposive movement of history? And therefore, is it all history by Trevor-Roper's criterion? Even if the formation and collapses of civilizations aren't history in the strict sense. We still write about them as part. You know, do we write about them as history? It seems so superficially again, but it's not clear. But Trevor-Roper does give some indication that he's interested in the broad sweep of history. Remember, I mentioned that Elton criticized him for implying that too detailed of a research was pettifogging and narrow, as it were. But he's not, at the same time, we can't just say that he was interested in big picture history, because he explicitly rejected universal history, especially he was very rough in his criticism of Toynbee. He wrote, Trevor-Roper wrote in a letter to James Shiel on 21 January 1992, quote, "As for poor old Toynbee and his protege, disciple, and biographer McNeill, who has tried so hard and so faithfully to praise him and has only succeeded in letting some very unattractive cast out of the bag, I believe that universal history is an impossibility in their terms, or in those of Hegel, Ranke, Spengler, and the Marxists. The lessons of history, in my opinion, must be allowed to emerge out of history. They are complex and tentative and conditional. The idea of a science of history, as proclaimed by the positivists of the late 19th and early 20th century, is to me a chimera. There are rules in history, but not of history. And so my favorite historians are Gibbon, who never forces the pace, and Jakob Burckhardt, whose historical understanding was so sensitive that he alone, of all the 19th century historians, succeeded in prophesying cautiously, but in fact accurately, the most important developments of the 20th century," unquote. So, no, he says that universal history is impossible on the terms of Toynbee, O'Neill, Hegel, Ranke, Spengler, and Marx. That's a very diverse group of historians and historical thinkers, but he leaves open the possibility that universal history might well be possible on other terms. But if we exclude all the presuppositions of Toynbee, O'Neill, Hegel, Ranke, Spengler, and Marx, what's left? And it seems to me that very little is left. But let's give Trevor-Roper the last word on this. And I will quote again from his past and present talk, which I quoted from earlier. Quote, "The philosophy of the greatest historians cannot be quickly summarized. It is not crude, it is subtle. And in the long work, it must be allowed to gradually to emerge," unquote. And I believe that is true of Trevor-Roper's implicit philosophy itself, philosophy of history, that is to say. So, happy birthday, Hugh Trevor-Roper, and thanks for listening.